I was 6 months pregnant, standing in my boss's corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Seattle, when Margaret Chen told me I was worthless and fired me on the spot. I had no idea that the venture capital firm I'd been secretly building on nights and weekends had just secured $40 million in funding. Or that in 6 months I'd return to this very building not as the dismissed junior analyst she'd thrown away, but as the lead investor in the acquisition deal that would determine whether her company survived. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I always love seeing our global community come together. If you enjoy stories about resilience, second chances, and proving your worth when everyone doubts you, make sure to hit that like button right now and subscribe to our channel so you never miss these inspiring true stories. Now, let me take you back to that devastating afternoon in March when I was just another overworked, undervalued employee who was about to lose everything. My name is Sarah Chen, and at 28 years old, I'd spent 3 years as a junior financial analyst at Pinnacle Investments, one of Seattle's most prestigious venture capital firms. 3 years of arriving before dawn and leaving after midnight. 3 years of meticulous research and brilliant investment recommendations that my boss Margaret presented as her own. 3 years of watching less qualified men get promoted while I remained stuck in the same position with the same inadequate salary of $62,000 in a city where my studio apartment alone cost $2,000 a month. I'd graduated top of my class from the University of Washington with a double major in finance and computer science, spent 2 years at a startup that went under, and landed at Pinnacle believing it was my chance to finally prove myself in the world of high-stakes investing. Margaret Chen was everything I wasn't. 47 years old, impeccably dressed in designer suits that cost more than my monthly rent, perfectly coiffed in a sharp black bob that never seemed to have a hair out of place. She commanded respect the moment she walked into a room. She'd built her reputation over 20 years in venture capital, known for her aggressive negotiation tactics and her ability to spot promising tech startups before anyone else. What people didn't know was that for the past 3 years, most of her successful picks had come from my research, my analysis, my late nights poring over financial statements and market trends while she took credit in boardroom presentations and industry conferences. I'd learned to accept it. That's what junior analysts did, right? We did the work, gained the experience, and eventually, if we were patient enough and good enough, we'd get our own chance to shine. I told myself that every time I watched Margaret present my findings to the partners, every time I saw my recommendations turn into million-dollar investments with her name attached, every time I was passed over for promotion while she collected bonuses that could have paid off my student loans twice over. But I had a secret. Something I'd been building in the shadows of my exhausting day job. 2 years ago, I'd met James Park at a tech networking event. He was a brilliant software engineer who'd just left Amazon with an idea for an AI-powered platform that could revolutionize supply chain management for small and medium-sized businesses. We'd started talking over cheap wine and conference room appetizers, and by the end of the night, I'd seen something in his idea that made my financial analyst brain light up with possibilities. We'd met for coffee the next week, then the week after that, and slowly, carefully, I'd helped him refine his business model, create financial projections, and develop a pitch that could attract serious investors. James had wanted me to be his co-founder and CFO from the beginning, but I'd been too afraid to leave the security of my Pinnacle salary. Too worried about what it would mean to walk away from a prestigious firm. Too concerned about health insurance and retirement accounts and all the practical things that kept people trapped in jobs that slowly crushed their spirits. So instead, I'd helped him nights and weekends, working on his startup called Chainlink Solutions, while maintaining my grueling schedule at Pinnacle, sleeping maybe 4 hours a night, surviving on coffee and determination, and the secret hope that maybe, just maybe, I was building something that could change my life. Then I'd met David at my best friend's wedding last fall. David Martinez, a kind-hearted pediatric nurse with warm brown eyes and a laugh that made me feel like everything might actually be okay. He was nothing like the aggressive, competitive finance bros I usually encountered in my professional world. He was gentle, thoughtful, genuinely interested in my ideas and dreams, and he'd looked at me like I was the most fascinating person he'd ever met. We'd fallen in love quickly, gotten married in a simple courthouse ceremony 3 months later because we both knew we'd found something rare and precious. And then, just after New Year's, I discovered I was pregnant. The pregnancy had been unplanned but wanted. David had been overjoyed, immediately starting to paint the tiny second bedroom in our apartment in soft yellows and greens, talking about names and futures and all the ways we'd make it work, even though money was tight. I'd been terrified and excited in equal measure, wondering how I'd manage a demanding job and a startup side project and impending motherhood, but determined to figure it out because that's what I'd always done. I figured things out, made impossible schedules work, found ways to do more with less, pushed through exhaustion and doubt because giving up had never been an option. I'd planned to wait until the end of my first trimester to tell Margaret about the pregnancy, following the conventional wisdom about keeping such news private until the risk of miscarriage decreased. But at 13 weeks, I'd started showing enough that my carefully chosen loose blouses couldn't completely hide the small bump. And I'd known I needed to have the conversation soon. I'd rehearsed what I'd say, prepared to assure her that I'd work right up until my due date, that I'd only take the minimum maternity leave, that this wouldn't affect my performance or dedication. I'd even prepared a detailed transition plan for my projects, proof that I'd thought through every contingency. What I hadn't prepared for was the particular cruelty of that March afternoon when Margaret called me into her office, and my world fell apart. It had started as a normal day, or at least as normal as any day could be when you were running on 4 hours of sleep and morning sickness that lasted all day, despite its misleading name. I'd arrived at 7 in the morning, as always, settling into my small cubicle with its view of other cubicles and fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. I'd been working on due diligence for a potential investment in a biotech startup, the kind of detailed financial analysis that I actually enjoyed, losing myself in numbers and projections, and the puzzle of determining whether a company's promises matched its potential. Around 2 in the afternoon, Margaret's assistant had appeared at my cubicle with her usual expression of mild disdain. Jessica was 23, fresh out of an Ivy League school, and she'd made it clear from her first day that she considered herself far too important to be fetching coffee or delivering messages to junior analysts. "Margaret wants to see you in her office immediately," she'd said, already turning away before I could respond. Her designer heels clicking against the polished floor with the confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about money, or respect, or proving her worth. I'd felt a flutter of nervousness in my stomach, though I'd told myself it was probably just pregnancy hormones making me anxious. Margaret rarely called me into her office for face-to-face meetings. Usually, she'd send terse emails with instructions or summon me to conference rooms where she'd present my work to partners, as if she'd done it herself. A private meeting in her office was unusual, and unusual in Margaret's world was rarely good. I'd smoothed down my navy blue maternity blouse, a recent purchase from Target that I'd chosen specifically because it was professional enough for the office while accommodating my growing belly, and made my way to the executive floor. The elevator ride up 3 floors had felt longer than usual, my reflection in the polished steel doors showing a young woman who looked tired despite her careful makeup, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her expression trying for confident but landing somewhere closer to apprehensive. Margaret's corner office was everything mine wasn't. Where I had a cubicle with gray fabric walls and a view of the copy machine, she had floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the Seattle skyline, the Space Needle visible in the distance, Elliott Bay sparkling in the afternoon sun. Her desk was a massive piece of dark wood that probably cost more than my car, its surface almost empty except for a sleek laptop and a single-framed photo of her with some tech industry billionaire at a conference. The walls displayed her degrees from Stanford and Wharton, photos of her shaking hands with famous entrepreneurs, awards from industry organizations that recognized her supposed brilliance. She'd been standing at the window when I'd entered, her back to me, her posture rigid in her charcoal gray Armani suit. She hadn't turned around when her assistant showed me in, hadn't acknowledged my presence for a long moment that stretched uncomfortably as I'd stood there wondering if I should sit, speak, or just wait. "Close the door," she'd finally said, her voice flat and cold in a way that made my stomach clench with dread. I'd closed it, the soft click seeming too loud in the suddenly oppressive silence of her office. "You wanted to see me?" She'd turned then, and the expression on her face had made my breath catch. I'd seen Margaret angry before, seen her frustrated and dismissive and coldly professional, but this was something different. This was contempt, pure and undisguised, the look someone gives to something they consider beneath notice, unworthy of even basic courtesy. "I'm going to make this quick because I have an actual important meeting in 15 minutes, she'd said, walking to her desk and remaining standing, forcing me to look up at her like a child being scolded by a teacher. "I've become aware that you're pregnant." The words had hit me like a physical blow, not because I'd been trying to hide it anymore, but because of the way she'd said it. Pregnant. Like it was a disease, a moral failing, something shameful that I should have had the decency to conceal. "Yes," I'd managed to say, my hand instinctively moving to my small bump in a protective gesture. "I was planning to discuss it with you soon. I'm due in September, and I've already started working on transition plans for my projects." "I don't care about your transition plans," she'd interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Do you have any idea how much time and resources this company has invested in you? 3 years of training, of giving you opportunities, of allowing you to work on high-level projects. And this is how you repay us? By getting pregnant and planning to abandon your responsibilities?" I'd felt heat rising in my cheeks, a mixture of shame and growing anger. "I'm not abandoning anything. I'm legally entitled to maternity leave, and I plan to return after—" "Maternity leave," she'd said with a harsh laugh that held no humor. "Let me tell you what maternity leave means in this industry, Sarah. It means you fall behind. It means you lose touch with deals and relationships and everything that matters in this business. It means you come back soft, distracted, unable to put in the hours required to actually succeed. I've seen it happen to dozens of women who thought they could have it all, who thought they could be mothers and serious professionals. They all end up choosing, and they always choose the baby, which means they become dead weight for companies that are trying to stay competitive." Each word had landed like a slap, and I'd felt tears starting to burn behind my eyes, but I'd refused to let them fall. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me cry. "That's not fair. I've never given you any reason to doubt my commitment or my work quality. Every project I've handled has been successful. Every recommendation I've made has been adequate." She'd cut me off again, moving around her desk to stand closer, using her height and position to intimidate. "You do adequate work, Sarah. You're a decent analyst, but let's not pretend you're exceptional. You're replaceable, and frankly, I should have replaced you months ago. The only reason I haven't is because you're cheap labor who's willing to work ridiculous hours for a salary that wouldn't attract anyone with actual talent." The cruelty of it had stolen my breath. 3 years of my life, 3 years of sacrificing sleep and health and any semblance of work-life balance, 3 years of brilliant analysis that had made her look good and made this company millions. And this was how she saw me. Adequate. Replaceable. Cheap labor. "You're wrong," I'd said, my voice shaking but growing stronger. "My work has been excellent, and you know it. Half of your successful investments in the last 2 years came from my research and recommendations. The cloud-based deal, the fintech startup that just went public, the AI company that got acquired for $300 million. Those were all my finds, my analysis." "Your finds?" She'd laughed again, that same cruel sound. You did preliminary research that I then refined and presented properly. You're a junior analyst, Sarah. You do the grunt work, and people like me turn it into actual business. That's how this industry works. And now you want me to believe you're going to continue being useful while you're waddling around pregnant, taking time off for doctor's appointments, and then disappearing for months to change diapers? Please. I'd felt something shift inside me then. Some final thread of respect or fear or whatever had been keeping me tethered to this job finally snapping. I'm legally protected. You can't fire me for being pregnant. I'm not firing you for being pregnant, she'd said smoothly, her expression shifting to something calculated and cold. I'm firing you for performance issues that have been building for months. Your work has been slipping. You've missed deadlines. You've made errors in your analysis. I have documentation of all of it. That's a lie, I'd said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. My work has been flawless. You don't have documentation because there's nothing to document. I have whatever documentation I need, she'd replied, pulling a folder from her desk drawer and dropping it in front of me. Your termination is effective immediately. You'll pack your personal items and leave the building within the hour. HR will contact you about your final paycheck and the return of company property. You'll sign a non-disclosure agreement and a non-compete clause. And if you're smart, you'll do it quietly without making a fuss that could damage your reputation in this industry. I'd stared at the folder, at the papers inside that I knew were fabricated lies, at the evidence of just how thoroughly she'd planned this ambush. She'd been preparing for this, documenting false performance issues, building a case that would protect her and the company from any discrimination lawsuit I might consider. She'd done this before, I'd realized. This wasn't her first time firing a pregnant employee or anyone else she considered inconvenient. You're a terrible person, I'd said quietly, the words escaping before I could stop them. You're brilliant at finance and terrible at being human. You've built your career on other people's work. You've crushed people who trusted you, and you've created a toxic environment where talent is wasted and kindness is seen as weakness. But you know what the saddest part is. You're so focused on winning, on being the smartest person in the room, on maintaining your reputation, that you can't see what you've become. You're successful and miserable and alone, and you've made everyone around you miserable too. Her face had gone white, then red, her carefully maintained composure cracking to show the rage underneath. Get out, she'd hissed. Get out of my office, pack your things, and get out of this building. You're worthless, Sarah. Worthless as an analyst, worthless as an employee, and you'll be worthless as a mother too. You'll struggle and fail and realize too late that you gave up a career for a baby that will only ever hold you back. Now get out before I have security escort you out. I'd picked up the folder with hands that shook with anger rather than fear, turned, and walked out of her office with my head high and my dignity intact, even as my heart shattered into pieces. I'd walked past Jessica's desk where she'd been pretending not to listen, past the other executives' offices where people had probably heard every word, past the conference room where I'd spent countless hours contributing to deals that would never have my name attached, and down to my cubicle where 3 years of my professional life fit into a single cardboard box. My coworkers had watched me pack with a mixture of sympathy and relief that it wasn't them, that they'd managed to avoid Margaret's wrath for another day. Marcus, another junior analyst who'd always been kind to me, had approached as I'd been taking down the few personal items I kept at my desk, a photo of David and me on our wedding day, a coffee mug my little sister had given me, a small, succulent plant that had somehow survived despite my neglect. Sarah, I'm so sorry, he'd said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. This is wrong. Everyone knows your work is excellent. If you need a reference or someone to testify about what really happened. Thank you, Marcus. I'd cut him off gently, knowing that any help he offered would only put his own job at risk. But I'll be okay. Take care of yourself. I'd carried my box to the elevator, ridden down to the lobby where the security guard who'd greeted me every morning for 3 years had looked away uncomfortably, and walked out into the gray Seattle afternoon, where rain was just beginning to fall. I'd stood on the sidewalk outside Pinnacle Investments, rain mixing with the tears I'd finally allowed to fall, my career in ruins, my reputation potentially destroyed, pregnant and unemployed in one of the most expensive cities in America, and I'd felt more lost than I'd ever felt in my life. But I'd also felt something else, something small and fierce and determined growing alongside the despair. I'd felt angry. Not just at Margaret, though God knows I was furious with her, but at a system that allowed people like her to thrive, at an industry that saw pregnancy as a liability rather than a normal part of human life, at the countless women who'd been pushed out of careers they'd built because they dared to want both professional success and a family. I'd called David from my car, sitting in the parking garage where I'd parked every morning for 3 years, my voice breaking as I'd told him what happened. He'd been furious, ready to drive to Pinnacle and confront Margaret himself, but I'd talked him down, told him it wouldn't help, that we needed to focus on what came next rather than what had just happened. He'd met me at home an hour later, held me while I cried, and then sat with me at our tiny kitchen table while we'd faced the terrifying reality of our situation. My salary had been our primary income. David made decent money as a nurse, but Seattle was expensive, and we'd been barely making ends meet even with both of us working. Now, with a baby coming in 6 months and my career potentially destroyed, we'd had to face the possibility of losing our apartment, of moving in with my parents in Spokane, of giving up on the life we'd been trying to build. But then I'd remembered Chainlink Solutions. I'd remembered James and the platform we'd been building, the pitch deck I'd helped perfect, the financial projections that showed real potential for massive growth. I'd pulled out my laptop and sent James a message. "Are you still looking for a co-founder and CFO? Because I just became available." He'd called me within 5 minutes, and we'd talked for 2 hours about the business, about where we were in the funding process, about what it would mean for me to come on board full-time. He'd been honest about the risks. We had interest from several venture capital firms, but nothing was guaranteed. And even if we got funding, it would be months before we could pay ourselves anything close to a real salary. It would mean working even harder than I'd been working at Pinnacle, but this time for myself, for something I believed in, for a future I could actually control. David and I had talked late into the night, running numbers, discussing possibilities, weighing the terrifying risk of going all in on a startup against the equally terrifying reality of trying to find another corporate job while pregnant, and potentially blacklisted by Margaret's influence in the Seattle finance community. In the end, we'd decided to bet on ourselves. We'd use our meager savings to survive for a few months. I'd work with James to secure funding, and if it all fell apart, well, we'd figure something out because that's what we always did. The next 3 months had been the hardest of my life. I'd worked 16-hour days despite pregnancy exhaustion and morning sickness that lasted all day, helping James refine our pitch, reaching out to every contact I'd made in my years at Pinnacle, leveraging relationships I'd built, even though Margaret had taken credit for my work. I'd discovered that people in the industry actually knew who I was, that my analysis and insights had been noticed even when my name wasn't on the presentations, that I had a reputation for brilliance that Margaret had tried to claim, but couldn't completely steal. We'd pitched to 15 different venture capital firms, faced rejection after rejection, heard every possible reason why our idea wouldn't work, or why we weren't the right team to execute it. I'd been visibly pregnant by then, and I'd seen the skepticism in investors' eyes, the unspoken concern about whether a woman about to have a baby could really commit to building a company. I'd addressed it head-on in every pitch, refusing to hide or apologize for my pregnancy, making it clear that being a mother wouldn't make me less capable or less committed, that women had been building businesses and raising children since the beginning of time, and it was about time the venture capital world caught up to that reality. And then finally, we'd found our champion. Catherine Morrison, a partner at Redwood Ventures, had seen something in our pitch that resonated with her. She was one of the few women in senior positions at a major VC firm, and she'd built her career on finding overlooked opportunities and backing unconventional founders. She'd done her own due diligence, talked to people who'd worked with me, and discovered the truth about my contributions at Pinnacle. She'd even, I'd learned later, had a conversation with Marcus who'd confirmed that most of Margaret's successful investments had originated from my research. Catherine had offered us $40 million in Series A funding at a valuation that made my head spin. $40 million to build Chainlink solutions, to hire a team, to develop our platform, to prove that our vision of revolutionizing supply chain management for small businesses wasn't just a dream, but a viable, valuable business opportunity. The deal had closed 2 weeks ago, and suddenly I'd gone from unemployed and desperate to co-founder and CFO of a well-funded startup with real potential to disrupt a multi-billion-dollar industry. But we'd kept it quiet, James and I and Catherine. We'd agreed to hold off on the public announcement until after we'd hired our initial team and set up our operations. We wanted to be ready for the attention, the scrutiny, the sudden interest from everyone who'd ignored us when we were just another startup with a pitch deck and a dream. We'd planned to announce in July, after I'd had the baby and had a few weeks to adjust to motherhood, when we could present Chainlink Solutions as a real company rather than just a promise. Which meant that when I'd walked out of Pinnacle Investments 3 months ago, no one had known that I wasn't just another fired employee, another pregnant woman pushed out of her career. No one had known that I was building something that could change my life and potentially change the industry. No one had known that the worthless junior analyst Margaret had dismissed so cruelly was about to become someone she'd have to reckon with. And now, 6 months after that devastating afternoon in Margaret's office, I was about to walk back into Pinnacle Investments, but this time everything was different. My daughter Emma had been born in September. A healthy, beautiful baby girl with David's warm brown eyes and my stubborn determination. I'd taken 6 weeks to recover and bond with her. 6 weeks of sleepless nights and overwhelming love, and the strange magic of learning to be someone's mother. David had taken parental leave from his nursing job, and we'd figured out our new reality together, learning to function on even less sleep than I'd gotten during my Pinnacle days, discovering reserves of patience and strength we hadn't known we possessed. Chainlink Solutions had launched publicly in October, and the response had been even better than we'd hoped. Our platform had attracted attention from major tech publications, interest from potential clients, and inquiries from businesses that saw the value in what we were building. We'd hired a team of brilliant engineers and business developers, people who believed in our vision and wanted to be part of something innovative. We'd moved into a real office space in South Lake Union, the tech hub of Seattle, with exposed brick and huge windows and a company culture that valued both excellence and humanity, where people could bring their whole selves to work, where parents weren't seen as liabilities but as human beings with complex lives. And then, 3 weeks ago, Catherine had called me with interesting news. Pinnacle Investments was struggling. Their recent investments had underperformed, they'd lost several key clients, and they were facing serious financial pressure. They needed capital, and they needed it fast, which meant they were looking for investors, or potentially even considering acquisition offers. Catherine's firm, Redwood Ventures, was interested in acquiring Pinnacle's portfolio and client list, but they wanted to do thorough due diligence first, which meant sending someone to evaluate the company's operations, culture, and leadership. "I want you to lead the evaluation," Catherine had said. "You know that company better than anyone. You understand their strengths and weaknesses, and you can assess whether they're worth acquiring or if we should let them fail. Are you interested?" I'd felt a surge of emotion so complex I couldn't name it all. Fear, excitement, vindication, anxiety, determination, and something that might have been anticipation of justice. When would this happen? "Next week," I've already set up a meeting with their leadership team. They don't know you'll be coming. I've kept the evaluation team confidential. But Sarah, I need to know you can do this professionally. I need to know you won't let your personal history with Margaret Chen compromise your judgment. I won't, I'd promised, and I'd meant it. This wasn't about revenge or showing up Margaret, though I'd be lying if I said those thoughts hadn't crossed my mind. This was about doing my job, evaluating a company fairly, and making a recommendation that would serve Redwood Ventures' interests. If Pinnacle deserved to be acquired, I'd recommend it. If they deserved to fail, I'd recommend that too. Either way, I'd do it with integrity and professionalism, because that's who I was, even when facing the woman who'd tried to destroy me. Which brought me to this moment, this November morning when I was preparing to walk back into Pinnacle Investments for the first time since Margaret had fired me. I was standing in my closet, Emma sleeping peacefully in her bassinet nearby, trying to decide what to wear to a meeting that felt weighted with more significance than any business meeting should carry. I'd chosen a tailored navy suit that I'd bought specifically for this occasion, expensive and perfectly fitted, the kind of suit that announced competence and success without being flashy. My body had mostly recovered from pregnancy, though I was softer now, curvier, different in ways that I'd learned to appreciate rather than apologize for. I'd pumped milk for Emma before getting dressed, left detailed instructions with David about her feeding schedule and nap times, kissed them both goodbye with a mixture of guilt and determination that I suspected would be a permanent feature of working motherhood. The drive to Pinnacle had been surreal, following the same route I'd driven for 3 years. Parking in the same garage, walking through the same lobby. But everything felt different now because I was different. I wasn't the anxious junior analyst hoping to prove herself anymore. I was Sarah Chen, co-founder and CFO of Chainlink Solutions, a company valued at over $200 million after our successful Series A funding and rapid growth. I was a mother, a wife, a business leader, someone who'd been knocked down and had gotten back up stronger. The receptionist had greeted me professionally, checking my name against the visitor list and directing me to the conference room on the executive floor. I'd ridden the elevator up with my heart pounding, carrying a leather portfolio that contained my evaluation materials and my professional dignity. The doors had opened onto the executive floor I'd walked past so many times, and I'd made my way to the large conference room where Pinnacle's leadership team was gathering. I'd arrived deliberately early, wanting to be settled and composed when they arrived rather than walking in after them. The conference room was exactly as I'd remembered it. Long table, expensive chairs, windows overlooking the city, the same corporate artwork on the walls that was meant to convey sophistication but just felt cold. I'd chosen a seat in the middle of one side of the table, arranged my materials, and waited. They'd started arriving 10 minutes before the scheduled meeting time. First the CFO, Richard Morrison, a competent man in his 50s who'd always been professionally courteous to me but had never gone out of his way to acknowledge my contributions. Then the head of operations, Jennifer Walsh, who'd been one of the few women in leadership and who'd disappointed me by never mentoring or supporting the younger women in the company. Then several partners whose names I'd known but who'd barely known I existed when I'd worked there. And then Margaret had walked in, and the world had seemed to slow down. She'd been looking at her phone, not paying attention to who was already in the room, talking to Jennifer about some client issue. She'd looked exactly as I'd remembered her. Perfectly styled black bob, expensive suit, that air of absolute confidence and control that made people defer to her automatically. She'd been in the middle of a sentence when she'd looked up and seen me sitting at the conference table, and I'd watched her face go through a series of expressions so quickly I'd almost missed them. Confusion first, her brain trying to process why I was there. Then recognition, her eyes widening slightly as she'd realized who I was. Then shock, her carefully maintained composure cracking as she'd understood that I wasn't there as a former employee or a visitor, but as someone with power and authority. And finally, something that looked like fear, a flash of vulnerability that I'd never seen on her face before. She'd frozen completely, her phone nearly slipping from her hand, her mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words coming out. The other executives had noticed her reaction and had looked at me with new curiosity, clearly wondering who I was and why Margaret looked like she'd seen a ghost. "Hello, Margaret," I'd said calmly, my voice steady and professional. "It's been a while." She'd recovered slightly, her face smoothing into a mask of professional neutrality, but I'd seen her hand tremble as she'd set her phone down on the table. "Sarah, I didn't realize you'd be here." "I'm leading the evaluation team for Redwood Ventures," I'd explained, watching her process this information. "We're considering acquiring Pinnacle's portfolio and client list, and I'm here to assess whether that would be a good investment. Please, everyone, have a seat. We have a lot to discuss." The room had filled with tension as everyone had taken their seats, Margaret choosing a spot directly across from me, her eyes never leaving my face. She'd looked like she wanted to say something, to explain or defend or maybe apologize, but the presence of her colleagues had kept her silent. Richard had cleared his throat and attempted to start the meeting with pleasantries, but I'd cut through them quickly. "Let's be direct about why we're here," I'd said, opening my portfolio and pulling out the evaluation documents. "Pinnacle Investments is facing significant financial challenges. Your recent investment performance has been poor, you've lost 3 major clients in the past 6 months, and your operating costs are unsustainable given your current revenue. Redwood Ventures is interested in acquiring your assets, but only if we determine that this company has value worth preserving. My job over the next few days is to evaluate your operations, your culture, your leadership, and your potential for recovery. I'll be conducting interviews with staff at all levels, reviewing your financial records and investment decisions, and assessing whether Pinnacle Investments deserves to survive or whether it should be allowed to fail." The bluntness of my words had shocked them. I could see it in their faces. They'd expected a standard corporate meeting with polite questions and diplomatic language. Instead, I'd laid out the stakes clearly and without sugarcoating. Pinnacle was failing, and I was there to determine if they were worth saving. "Now," I'd continued, looking directly at Margaret, "let's start with leadership. Margaret, you've been the senior partner here for 8 years. Walk me through your investment strategy and explain why your recent performance has been so dramatically worse than your earlier years." She'd struggled to answer, her usual confidence faltering as she'd tried to explain away the failures without admitting that her earlier successes had been built on other people's work. I'd watched her fumble through explanations about market conditions and bad luck and circumstances beyond her control, and I'd seen the other executives shifting uncomfortably as they'd realized that their leader didn't have good answers. I'd spent the rest of that first meeting asking pointed questions, reviewing documents, and making notes while the Pinnacle leadership team had grown increasingly nervous. I'd been professional and fair, but I hadn't pulled punches or accepted weak explanations. This was business, and I was good at business, and they were finally seeing what I'd always been capable of when I wasn't being held back or having my work stolen. When the meeting had ended after 3 hours, Margaret had tried to catch me alone, hovering near the door as the others had filed out. "Sarah, can we talk? Privately?" "We can schedule a one-on-one interview as part of the evaluation process," I'd said coolly. "Have your assistant coordinate with my office. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other meetings today." I'd walked out of that conference room with my head high, feeling the weight of their stares on my back, knowing that word would spread through the company within hours. Sarah Chen was back, but not as the junior analyst they'd dismissed. She was back as someone with the power to determine their futures, and that changed everything. The next 3 days had been intense. I'd interviewed dozens of employees, from senior partners to administrative assistants, asking questions about company culture, leadership effectiveness, and workplace satisfaction. What I'd discovered had been both enlightening and disturbing. The company culture was toxic, dominated by fear and favoritism, with high turnover among talented young employees who left as soon as they could find other opportunities. Margaret's leadership style had created an environment where people competed viciously rather than collaborated, where credit was stolen and blame was assigned, where anyone who showed weakness or had personal needs was seen as expendable. I'd reviewed financial records and discovered that Pinnacle's decline had started almost exactly when I'd left. The investments that had been successful in recent years had almost all originated from research I'd done before my termination. After I'd left, Margaret had tried to replicate that success but had lacked the analytical skills and intuition that had made my work valuable. She'd made increasingly risky bets, chased trends rather than identifying genuine opportunities, and ignored warning signs because admitting she'd made mistakes would have damaged her reputation. I'd also discovered that I wasn't the only pregnant employee Margaret had fired. In the past 5 years, she'd terminated 3 other women shortly after they'd announced pregnancies, always with fabricated performance issues, always with documentation that protected the company legally while destroying the women's careers. One of those women had been forced to leave the industry entirely, unable to find another position after Margaret had quietly spread word that she was unreliable. Another had struggled through a difficult pregnancy alone after losing her job and health insurance. The pattern was clear and damning. On the 4th day, I'd finally scheduled my one-on-one interview with Margaret. She'd arrived at the small office I'd been using for private meetings looking different than I'd ever seen her. Her suit was still expensive, her hair still perfectly styled, but there was something diminished about her, a crack in the armor of absolute confidence she usually wore. She'd sat across from me with her hands folded on the table, and for the first time since I'd known her, she'd looked uncertain. "Thank you for meeting with me," she'd said quietly, a far cry from the commanding tone she'd used in every previous interaction we'd had. "This is part of the evaluation process," I'd replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm interviewing all senior leadership. I have some questions about your management practices and decision-making." "Before we start with your questions, I need to say something," she'd interrupted, and I'd seen her hands tighten on the table. "I owe you an apology. What I did to you 6 months ago was wrong. The way I treated you, the things I said, the way I fired you, it was all wrong, and I'm sorry." I'd studied her face, trying to determine if this apology was genuine or strategic, if she was sorry for what she'd done, or just sorry that it had come back to haunt her. "Why did you do it, Margaret? I worked hard for you for 3 years. I was good at my job. Why did you treat me like I was worthless?" She'd looked away, staring at the wall behind me, and when she'd spoken, her voice had been softer than I'd ever heard it. "Because I was terrified. Terrified that you were better than me, that people would realize where my successful investments were really coming from, that I'd built my reputation on a foundation that wasn't entirely my own. When you got pregnant, I saw it as an opportunity to get rid of the threat you represented before you could challenge me for real. I told myself I was protecting the company, protecting our competitive edge, but really I was just protecting myself and my position." The honesty had surprised me, though I'd suspected as much. "And the other women you fired? The other pregnant employees whose careers you destroyed? Were you threatened by all of them too?" Her face had paled. "You know about them." "I know about everything, Margaret. I've done my due diligence. I've talked to former employees, reviewed termination records, documented patterns. You've been systematically discriminating against pregnant women for years, and you've been getting away with it because you're smart enough to create paper trails that protect you legally while destroying people's lives." "I know," she'd whispered, and I'd seen tears forming in her eyes, which had shocked me more than anything else. "I know what I've done, and I know it's unforgivable. I've spent my entire career fighting to succeed in a male-dominated industry, and somewhere along the way, I became the kind of person who tears other women down instead of lifting them up. I became exactly what I always hated." "Why are you telling me this?" I'd asked. "Why admit it now?" "Because you're going to recommend that Redwood Ventures not acquire Pinnacle," she'd said, looking directly at me. "Because this company is going to fail, and I'm going to lose everything I've built, and I deserve it. But before that happens, I wanted you to know that I see what I did to you. I see what I've done to this company and to all the people I've hurt. And I'm sorry. It doesn't change anything, and it doesn't make what I did okay, but I'm sorry." I'd sat with that for a long moment, feeling the weight of her apology, the sincerity I heard in her voice, the genuine remorse that seemed to be breaking through her usually impenetrable facade. Part of me had wanted to accept it, to offer forgiveness, to tell her that people could change and grow. But another part of me, the part that remembered standing in the rain outside this building 6 months ago feeling worthless and destroyed, couldn't quite let go of the anger. "Your apology doesn't undo the damage," I'd said finally. "It doesn't give back the careers you destroyed, or the confidence you shattered. It doesn't erase the fear and humiliation and desperation you made people feel. But I appreciate that you're acknowledging it, even if it's too late to matter." "Are you going to recommend the acquisition?" she'd asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "I'm going to recommend that Redwood Ventures not acquire Pinnacle Investments," I'd confirmed. "Not because of what you did to me personally, but because this company is fundamentally broken. The culture is toxic, the leadership is flawed, and the business model isn't sustainable. Acquiring Pinnacle would mean taking on all of those problems, and it's not worth the investment. Some companies deserve to fail, Margaret, and this is one of them." She'd nodded slowly, accepting the verdict with a resignation that suggested she'd been expecting it. "What about the employees? The people who work here who didn't do anything wrong?" "I'm recommending that Redwood Ventures offer positions to select Pinnacle employees who show promise and align with our values," I'd said. "We'll be reaching out to junior analysts, researchers, and other staff members who've been undervalued here. We'll give them opportunities to grow in an environment that actually appreciates their contributions. As for the leadership team..." I'd paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "You'll need to figure out your next steps on your own." "Fair enough," she'd said quietly. "For what it's worth, Sarah, I think you're going to be incredibly successful. You already are. You've built something real, something valuable, and you've done it with integrity. I hope you'll be the kind of leader I should have been." I'd stood up then, signaling that our meeting was over. "I intend to be. And Margaret, I hope you learn from this. I hope you figure out how to be better, how to build people up instead of tearing them down. Because you're talented and intelligent, and you could have been great if you hadn't been so afraid." She'd stood as well, and for a moment we just looked at each other across the small office. Two women who'd been on such different paths, and who'd ended up in this strange moment of reckoning. Then she'd extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, I'd shaken it. "Good luck, Sarah," she'd said. "Good luck, Margaret," I'd replied, and I'd meant it, at least a little bit. The final day of my evaluation had been spent writing my comprehensive report for Catherine and the Redwood Ventures board. I'd documented everything I'd found: the toxic culture, the poor financial performance, the leadership failures, the pattern of discrimination. I'd also identified 15 employees who I believed would be valuable additions to either Chainlink Solutions or other Redwood portfolio companies, talented people who'd been held back by Pinnacle's environment, but who had real potential. My recommendation had been clear: do not acquire Pinnacle Investments. Let the company fail, offer positions to select employees, and allow the market to correct the mistake that had been Margaret Chen's leadership. It wasn't a decision I'd made lightly, and it wasn't about revenge, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some satisfaction in it. It was about making the right business decision, and about recognizing that some organizations were too broken to save. Catherine had accepted my recommendation without question, trusting my analysis and my judgment. Within a week, Redwood Ventures had formally withdrawn their acquisition interest, and Pinnacle Investments had been left to face their financial crisis alone. The company would likely be liquidated within months, its assets sold off, its reputation destroyed. Margaret would survive. People like her always did. But she'd never have the same level of power or prestige again. As for the employees I'd identified, 12 of them had accepted positions with either Chainlink Solutions or other Redwood companies. Marcus, the junior analyst who'd been kind to me on my last day at Pinnacle, had joined my team as a senior analyst, and I'd been grateful to work with someone who shared my values and understood what it meant to build a culture of respect and collaboration. Now, 2 weeks after I'd walked out of Pinnacle for the final time, I was sitting in my office at Chainlink Solutions, Emma sleeping in a bassinet nearby because I'd learned that I could be both a mother and a CEO, that the two roles didn't have to be in conflict. My company was thriving, our platform was gaining traction, and we were on track to revolutionize supply chain management exactly as we'd promised. I had a team of brilliant people who respected each other and worked together, a company culture that valued both excellence and humanity, and a future that felt full of possibility rather than limitation. David had brought me lunch from my favorite Thai restaurant, kissing me and Emma before heading back to the hospital for his afternoon shift. I'd eaten while reviewing financial projections, pumped milk while on a conference call with potential clients, and somehow managed to feel like I was succeeding at all of it, even when it felt impossibly hard. My phone had buzzed with a text from Catherine. Board meeting next week to discuss Series B funding. They're impressed with Q4 performance? Well done, Sarah. I'd smiled, feeling a surge of pride and gratitude and determination. I'd come so far from that devastated woman standing in the rain 6 months ago, from the junior analyst who'd let people take credit for her work, from the pregnant employee who'd been called worthless and fired for daring to want both a career and a family. I'd learned that worth wasn't something other people could give or take away. It was something I had to claim for myself, something I had to believe in even when no one else did. I'd learned that kindness wasn't weakness, and that compassion didn't make you soft. It made you strong enough to build something real, something lasting, something that made other people's lives better. I'd learned that being underestimated could be an advantage, that people who dismissed you often didn't see you coming until it was too late. I'd learned that failure wasn't the end, but sometimes the beginning, that being knocked down gave you the chance to get back up differently, stronger, more authentically yourself. Most importantly, I'd learned that success wasn't about proving yourself to people who doubted you. It was about proving something to yourself, that you were capable, that you were valuable, that you deserved the opportunities you created and the life you built. Margaret's opinion of me had never mattered as much as I'd thought it did. The only opinion that truly mattered was my own, and I'd finally learned to trust it. Emma had woken up then, making the small sounds that meant she was hungry, and I'd set aside my work to feed her, holding my daughter and feeling the weight and wonder of everything I'd become. I was a mother, a wife, a CEO, a friend, a leader, a woman who'd been broken and had put herself back together into something even better than before. And somewhere across the city, Margaret was probably sitting in her office at a company that was dying, facing the consequences of her choices, learning the hard way that success built on other people's backs was never sustainable. I didn't take pleasure in her downfall, but I didn't mourn it either. Some lessons could only be learned through loss, and maybe this would be hers. As for me, I had everything I needed. Not everything I'd planned for or expected, but something better. A life I'd built myself, a company I believed in, a family I loved, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing I'd faced the worst and survived it. I'd walked out of Margaret's office 6 months ago feeling worthless. and I'd walked back in as someone who knew her worth and didn't need anyone else's validation to believe it. That was the real victory, the real transformation. Not the successful company, or the vindication, or the moment when Margaret had frozen at seeing me. It was the journey from doubt to certainty, from seeking approval to granting it to myself, from being invisible to being impossible to ignore. I was Sarah Chen, co-founder and CFO of Chainlink Solutions, mother to Emma, wife to David, and I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because someone had given me permission or opportunity, but because I'd created it myself. And that made all the difference. What an incredible journey Sarah took from being dismissed as worthless to becoming the person who determined her former company's fate. Her story reminds us that our worth isn't defined by how others treat us, but by how we respond to adversity and what we build from the ashes of disappointment. Have you ever made a choice between doing what's expected and standing up for your own value? Share your story in the comments below. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that resilience and integrity always matter more than others' opinions, please show your support by hitting that like button. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you never miss our inspiring stories about real people whose courage and determination changed their lives. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.